There is a sense out there, whether it started with Brexit or the election of Donald Trump or even earlier, that many liberal democracies face a challenge that's beyond the everyday back and forth of politics. Instead, it's got the ring of us versus them, of my country first versus multiculturalism, a questioning about who gets to be part of the people. Should we be worried about where this takes us? Let's find out. As we ask, Yascha Mounk, lecturer at Harvard University, host of the Good Fight podcast, and author most recently of The People versus Democracy, Why Our Freedom is in Danger and How to Save It. And also joining us, Andrew Coyne, columnist with the National Post, and as I introduced him last time he was on the program, all-around good guy. Nice to have both of you here for this conversation. Yascha, I want to start with you because you were on this program just a few months ago. There were elections since then in Italy, Hungary, and Sweden.
And Ontario.
And Ontario. That's true. It may not lead to where this question is going, but fair to say, I don't think immigration was a huge part of the Ontario election, but was it in the other three?
Yes, absolutely. It was the dominant topic. So you've seen, in Sweden, for example, a country in which all of the things that supposedly are going to cure us from populism in other countries are already there. They already have a very well-functioning welfare state. They've actually had some real improvements in living standards over the last 20 or so years. But because of immigration, and particularly because of the refugee crisis, the populists have been able to exploit that quite strongly. And it's one of the big reasons why they are now the strongest they've ever been. This is a party which is actually more radical than right-wing parties in many other European countries. It has roots in the neo-Nazi movement only about 20 years ago. And they now are the third strongest party in the country.
So even besides those three elections we just talked about, would you say that immigration has dramatically changed the political landscape across the entire European Union over the last few years?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's actually important to understand that there's two things going on here. So one is the sort of acute cause of a refugee crisis. But in a number of countries that took in a lot of refugees, there's a big rebellion against it. There's anger about the handling of ongoing integration. But I think it's also a more slow-moving set of causes. So you actually saw the anger about this rising even before the refugee crisis. And that's really a question about the immigration we've had in the last 50 or 60 years, and a big debate about what the future of a multi-ethnic society should look like, and to what extent the majority population should accommodate newcomers.
Well, let's see what the people have to say. We have a polling company in this country called Angus Reid, suggests that immigration is becoming, in fact, also here, an increasingly controversial issue. If you want to look up at the monitors here come the numbers. The poll found that 49% of Canadians want to see the federal government's 2018 target of more than 300,000 immigrants reduced. So the numbers of Canadians wanting a reduction in immigration is also up 13% since 2014. Only 31% said the target should stay the same. Only 6% wanted to see even more immigration. Andrew, those numbers, what do they tell you?
They're built upon a base that can go back some period of time. I mean, they are up somewhat from where they were before, but immigration is always a somewhat controversial issue, even in this country. And this country, of course, is an immigrant-receiving country from its founding. It's doubly so, of course, when you're looking at Europe, where you have countries that have never really seen themselves as immigrant-receiving countries, don't have quite the same sense of civic nationalism, of a nationalism that's non-ethnically based, but is more based on a common set of ideas. And so you can see how it's particularly, for all the reasons that were said, why it's particularly salient there. In Canada, I think to some extent we're importing some of these attitudes, as we always do, particularly from the States. There's a certain sort of copycatism in this. And also, we're looking at a relatively minor issue on our borders of people showing up, asylum seekers, by informal or irregular or illegal methods, whatever word you want to use. And that's obviously given the issue more salience. I think people have, particularly in the political world, have exaggerated the state of that and how big a threat it represents to, order and law, et cetera. But I think that's fed some of this.
Any thought about why we would be copycats here in Canada for the American phenomenon you just described, when we have a prime minister who clearly is not trafficking in that kind of language, unlike the president of the United States?
Yeah.
And up until 3 months ago, we had a premier of Ontario for the last 4 years who also was quite not there in terms of indulging in that kind of language.
Sure, and well, partly that just says there's differences of opinion in the country. So some people have decided they're going to follow the Trumpian model or whatever the concerns are that in the States and absorb them. We do that on every issue under the sun in this country. Oftentimes we import left-wing ideas from the States as well in our history. But I think nevertheless it's significant that there's been less of an upsurge of populist nationalism in this country than there has been elsewhere. And that's partly because, well, what's the cause and what's the effect in terms of the government that we elected? But it's significant that they've taken a different tack. And, Justin Trudeau went out to the airport to welcome the Syrian refugees here.
With Premier Wynne.
That's right. So, but also, we haven't gone through some of the same traumas that both the United States and Europe have gone through in the last 20 years. This is a much larger discussion than just immigration, but it's one of those things that's fed into distrust of elites, distrust of globalism, quote unquote. Yes. And one aspect of that emerges as distrust of immigration and the people, supposedly elites, who are forcing it upon us.
So I think there's also three sort of distinct advantages that Canada has compared to virtually every European country. The first is, as you mentioned, that it's always been a country of immigration. That you have had, at one point in time, a strict racial and ethnic and religious hierarchy, and that the process of trying to overcome that is very complicated and it's going to take a long time, and does cause some of the people who have to give up some of the privileges they used to have to be angry at that. But there's always been this sense of a Canadian can come from anywhere in the world, and that's very important. The second is that immigration in Canada has always primarily been high-skill immigration. Because of the point system, because of your natural borders, you have always been able to choose immigrants. And the best predictor of whether or not immigrants are going to integrate well is not the religion they might have, is not the part of the world they might become from, it's certainly not the skin color, it's whether they're high-skill immigrants or low-skill immigrants. And then thirdly, as a result, you don't have one dominant immigrant group.
Yes.
So what's quite worrying, I think, in many countries, when you have one clear majority group that's pretty homogeneous, and then one dominant minority groups. And that makes it easy for those two groups to start to hate each other and so on. In Canada, you have a dwindling majority group and lots of different minority groups. And that's a much more healthy situation.
Kind of helps keep the peace, doesn't it?
Oh, yeah.
In that respect.
I mean, you stand in a street corner in Toronto and you will see a conversation happening amongst five people of, 5 different skin colors and ethnicities and languages. It really brings that point home that people are, that it breaks down that polarization into us and them.
Anybody who knows Adrienne Clarkson, who is our former Governor General here in Canada, will not be surprised to have heard her say the following. We need immigrants. We know that when they come, they do fit in. They learn the language. They go to schools. They participate. All the other stuff is just rhetoric and populist nonsense. It's racist, it's prejudice, and bigotry. You want to sign on to that?
I wouldn't necessarily go that far. There certainly are people who would fit all those descriptions. There are other people who are just concerned about where society is going. And we have to extend some degree of good faith that people may not simply have thought through an issue. And they may emerge with positions that you or I might not agree with, but it may not begin from a place of hatred. It just may begin from a place of confusion and concern. There's a legitimate grounds to say, look, we want to make sure that the people who are coming across our border are coming in by lawful means and that they're being, particularly in this day and age of terrorism, it's legitimate to say we want to make sure that we're vetting everybody who comes in. I don't think that's anything untoward about that. It's when you start to exaggerate the importance of things or attach things to it that don't belong there. For example, it's not illegitimate to say, I'd like to make sure that we can hold together as a society in Canada, that we have some degree of common ideals or even that word values. That's
what Maxime Bernier said on this program the other night.
And as far as that goes, that's not, in my opinion, not an illegitimate subject for discussion. It's when you then say, and the things that are threatening that are these people who are coming here from somewhere else. At the very minimum, you better be able to show that rather than just simply asserting it, and there's been a lot of that.
Can you help us understand where that line is between, yes, we can have a discussion about competing values, and that's okay, but othering is not acceptable? Where's that line?
I think the line is more straightforward than people sometimes think or say. I mean, we live in a liberal democracy, which means that we want to preserve people's individual rights, and those rights can't depend on the religion, the skin color, and so on. And so it is utterly unacceptable to treat people who are legally in this country any different depending on those characteristics. It is unacceptable to do what the President of the United States has done, which is to say anybody who has a particular religion can't come into this country. And then I think it's legitimate democratically to debate about how many people we should let in. Now, I tend to be on the more permissive end of that in those kinds of debates. I'm not Canadian. I don't want to judge whether Canada has the right amount of immigration or should have more or should have less. If I had to take a guess, I would say it's probably about the right amount. But I don't think that there's anything inherently illegitimate, much less racist, if some people say, you know what, we actually feel like there's a lot of immigration right now, and why don't we slow the pace of that a little bit? If you're not victimizing people already in the country, if you're not making cultural or religious stipulations or racial stipulations about who's allowed to come in, I think that's a legitimate point of view in a democracy. I'm likely to disagree with it, but that's fine. Let's have it out of the ballot box.
This is going to be very contrarian, what I'm about to say, but I have a neighbor who's a real estate agent, and he's been in the business for a very long time. And he says the people in his experience who are the most racist in terms of, I don't want those kinds of people buying a house in my neighborhood, are not, as Stephen Harper called them, old stock Canadians, white Anglo-Saxons from way back. It is people of color. It is people who have come here, in his view, from other places, who are concerned, apropos of your former point, that we are importing people into this country who may not share our kind of Western-oriented free speech, equality of the genders, and so on and so forth kind of values. At what point are the people, are minorities? At what point are minorities who object to increased multiculturalism or object to increased immigration allowed to express those views without being attacked?
Well, I'm in an invidious position here, being a white male, just answering this. But having said that, it is true that you see some degree, and you see this in some of the polling data, of people who've gone through the immigration system, have gone through all the hoops, et cetera, being, I think, understandably dismayed if other people are perceived or are not doing the
jump in the queue.
And so that's totally understandable. It's also understandable that people who are of color will feel less inhibited about some of these discussions for the reasons that I just said at the outset there, that they won't feel that they're in a privileged group.
They feel they have license to
do so. They have a bit more license. I would say something to the contrary, though, at the same time, which is I find that the people who are the most fervent adherents of the classic liberal model of society, of everyone is an equal individual, we should try to get along with each other on the basis of equality as individuals rather than just trying to fit together a jigsaw puzzle of groups. The people who consistently restore my faith in that ideal are recent immigrants, many of whom have come from societies that have been organized around caste and race and religion and don't want any part of that. And maybe they are overly concerned about it. Maybe that's not as great a fear as they or I might have in our society. But it cheers me that they're saying, yeah, what we really came to Canada for was this Western liberal idea that so many people are criticizing now.
This is an important point. I think one of the ways to really address the fears that some people in the society have is to be clear that we will insist on that model. That there's nothing wrong with saying that we obviously celebrate difference. We obviously celebrate people having their own religions, having, even in a fixed sense, their own cultures, that they will continue to speak the ancestral languages at home, that they will cook different foods from each other, and so on and so forth. But we have a base of common values, and that it is more important to be Canadian than all those other things. You have multiple identities. That's always going to be the case in Canada, and hopefully it's increasingly going to be the case in countries in Western Europe. But the citizenship component has to be very important. I was at a debate earlier today in Toronto, in which people were starting to say, concepts like citizenship are deeply problematic because not everybody is a citizen, not everybody is included. And so therefore, we really shouldn't talk about citizenship at all. And I agree with the first half of this, that certainly in the United States, and to some degree in Canada, there's people who are here who are not citizens, who can't properly participate, and that's a problem we have to address. But that's all the more reason to include them in this notion and to actually defend that there's something special about citizenship, and there's something special about a solidarity with our fellow citizens.
Don't go there yet, because I know you want to come back on this, and we are going to get to this, but I want to do one thing first before we go there. You and I know Michael Ignatieff from his time as federal Liberal leader. Do you know him from his time at Harvard?
I do, yes.
You do, okay. Big Red Sox fan too, incidentally. So he's not all bad, I guess is what I'm saying. Here he is. When was this done? Here's Michael Ignatieff after Brexit, before Trump, in that sort of 2/3 of the way through 2016. Sheldon, go.
People want control of their borders. They want to have a sense that when they vote, the votes they take determine what national policy is. The sense of losing democratic control of your country, the sense of losing control of your borders, just created a situation in which Brexit won handily. And so I'm not, to your question, I think the European Union will survive. But the challenge that Brexit poses is once again to liberal democracy. can liberals who believe in open borders and tolerance and multiculturalism develop a set of arguments that says to people who are frightened by globalization, look, we hear you. You want a country that controls its borders. You want a country that's sovereign over its national affairs. You want a country where you feel patriotic pride in your country's accomplishments. All that language has to be part of what a liberal, small L liberal, I'm out of politics, I'm a small L liberal, what a small L liberal believes in.
Yascha, I want to follow up on that by, echoing something Donald Trump said at the United Nations the other day. Where he said, I'm not the president of the United Nations, I'm the president of the United States of America. Mm-hmm. And so, given that comment, given Michael Ignatieff's comment, can a small L liberal embrace patriotism in this increasingly globalizing world?
Well, the most striking thing that Donald Trump said in front of the UN General Assembly is that his administration had achieved more than any before in human history.
He did say that.
And was roundly laughed out of the room.
Yes.
It was quite a moment. You're spiking the football a little bit, and that I find it hard to associate myself in any kind of sense with Donald Trump. Nevertheless, I do think that we need to fight for our notion of patriotism and nationalism against people like Donald Trump. So I grew up thinking in many ways that it would be great to overcome patriotism and nationalism, that it would be great to live in a world in which our allegiance is universal, in which we care as much about people who are really far away as people who are close to us and so on. But I think when you look at the last 20 years of politics and take seriously what's been happening, you realize that nationalism retains an incredibly strong force, and that people like Donald Trump want to use it in order to victimize minorities, in order to beat up on other nations. And I think the best way to defend against that is to try and fight for what our interpretation of patriotism should be. And it's twofold. The first is that it's got to be inclusive. That for us, unlike for somebody like Donald Trump, you can be a Muslim and American, you can be a Muslim and Canadian, you can be black or brown, it does not matter. Anybody who lives here is part of our club, and that's what we understand under patriotism. And the second is about what it means to fight for your interests. The phrase America first has a horrible history, but in a sense, it is a natural expression of what every political leader does. If Michael Ignatieff had become Prime Minister of Canada, he would have fought for Canadian interests. That is completely normal. But Michael Ignatieff understands that there's no conflict between Canada's national interests and those of many other countries. Mm-hmm. But there's lots of win-wins in international relations in which I can fight for my interests, but they also help to serve your interests because we can cooperate. And the problem with somebody like Donald Trump is that he isn't willing to acknowledge that.
Let me, in helping you set up your response to that, quote you.
That's dirty pool.
Here's Andrew Coyne in the National Post. Sheldon, if you would. Until comparatively recently, German law held that no one could become a citizen who was not of German blood, even if they and their forebears had been living in the country for generations. By contrast, it is enough in Canadian law to have been here for one day, your birthday, to be a citizen in perpetuity, even if you spend the rest of your life abroad. Stranger still, your children, though they never set foot in the country, will also automatically be citizens. This is remarkably unfair when you think about it. We talk a lot of white privilege or male privilege, but the biggest single advantage anyone can have, the advantage we all share, is to live in Canada. Were we more aware of our own extraordinary good fortune, our lottery win, we might feel more obliged to share it with others. Okay, starting with that, pick up the torch, run with it, and speak to what he said.
Well, I'll start with that then. This is that yes, we in any discussion of immigration, and I don't dispute that we're entitled as citizens of this country to set our own immigration policy, but we should at least be conscious of the fact that we didn't do anything to earn our particular status other than choosing our parents well, yes. and happening to be born here. And you can have a more radical discussion about whether or not that should be the basis of citizenship, but at the very least, let's be conscious of that, and it should induce a certain humility in us in discussing it. I would certainly agree that there's nothing illiberal about, per se, about nationalism or patriotism. And to echo the point made, there's nothing wrong with the American president standing for the American interest. It's the idea that the American interest implies protectionism and pulling out of every international organization and these kinds of things. That's a particular take on that interest that you can take or leave. Nationalism, like many other things, can be both positive and negative. It's positive when it's the nationalism of we are us, when we have a sense of our commonality and are able to sense a connection to each other. And to make the exact point, it enables us to care about people that we've never met. If somebody's lost off the coast of Newfoundland, we're going to take a greater interest in that than we would if they were lost, unfortunately, off of the coast of South America or anywhere else. We have that connection. What that suggests to me is the positivity of it is the degree to which nationalism leads us to wider and wider feelings of allegiance. And ultimately, we should all feel that same allegiance to humanity at large, but we don't. We're human beings. But nationalism at least gets us halfway there, if it's that kind of nationalism. When it becomes the nationalism of we are not you, of that exclusion, whether it's excluding people inside the country or being vituperative against people outside our country, that's when it loses its moral force. So it can be a force for good, it can be a moral thing, but it can also be the opposite. And the last one on that I would say is, the thing that infuses it with moral purpose, I think, is a sense of common purpose and mission, of the objectives and the ideals that we want to aspire to. One of the things I admire about the United States of America is that their nationalism, certainly traditionally, has been not one founded on blood and soil, but one founded in the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. And it's a real thing. You talk to any American, and they know their rights, and they attach enormous importance to the constitutional history of the country. That's a very positive thing, I think. It enables that very contentious, oftentimes very divided society to hold it together. That they still, notwithstanding all of that, you don't see significant separatist movements in the United States.
You just used the N word. Notwithstanding. we've had a good workout with that word in the last couple of weeks, haven't we? What do you think about the notion, Yascha, that it is unjust to have kind of a leg up as a citizen in a country that you were lucky enough to be born in on your birthday and maybe have no other connection to besides that?
Well, first of all, I just want to point out a nice piece of patriotism in your article, which is that you say, as though it was utterly evident, that the most extraordinary privilege you can have in the world is to be Canadian. And I like that, right? I mean, I might find it a little bit cold and so on, but it's
look around.
It's
a nice.
Bad. It's quite nice at the moment, yeah. But it is, a nice expression of what actually makes you generous. And I agree with much of your sentiment in that article. I think it's right that it is an incredible luck and privilege to be a member of a liberal democracy in which you're treated decently, no matter who you are, in which you have access to opportunity and to some amount of economic wealth. And we should sometimes not just remember the ways in which our societies are unjust, and that's something we have to be upfront about and fight against, but also the ways in which it's vastly better to live in Canada or the United States or Germany or Sweden than it is to live in North Korea or Venezuela or Turkey or a whole set of places where people don't have those things.
And so, better than it was 50 or 100 years ago as well.
Absolutely. And so it is an extraordinary privilege, and I think we do need to feel that that is an act of luck, and we should think carefully about what it makes us owe towards other people. But I think people are going to be more receptive to that argument if it's based in precisely the kind of self-confident sentiment that you expressed. If it's based on this country has a lot to offer, and we can be proud to be Canadian, we can feel the solidarity with each other, and because of that, out of this sense of already having a lot and having been lucky, we should also be moved towards generosity.
With a minute left, Andrew, let me give it to you to talk about, in which case, how do defenders of liberal democracy need to think about populism today, given everything we've talked about, to ensure that we don't make the cleavages and the polarization even worse?
Well, it starts by taking it seriously, and it doesn't come from nowhere, and there are some legitimate grievances that perhaps have been expanded. Some people's response is to say that we should either be less liberal or less democratic in the face of this challenge. My response is we should be more of both. That liberalism and democracy, while they're in some ways are in tension with each other, liberalism exists in some ways to defend against the tyranny of the majority, are also mutually reinforcing. It's no accident that they tend to go together. That the equality of every individual is not only a bedrock democratic principle, everybody gets one vote, it's also the bedrock of liberalism, of defense against oppression. I think we need to take seriously the idea of greater and deeper democracy, that some of what people are responding to is this feeling that they don't have any say. They don't have any say in their own national politics, that they don't feel they have efficacy there, and that they see increasing amounts of things being put offshore into international, supranational organizations. I don't think those organizations are invalid or their purposes are invalid, but we should recognize there's a democratic deficit there if we're telling people you just have to accept this because the World Trade Organization has said so. Yeah. I think that's a problem we're going to be wrestling with with a lot of these issues that are now global in scope, and we don't have the democratic international structures. We haven't democratized those structures yet to address those.
I want to thank you too, if I can put it this way, big brains, for coming on our program today and having a really great discussion about something that is timely and important. Yascha Mounk, The People versus Democracy, Why Our Freedom is in Danger and How to Save It. And of course, you can read Andrew Coyne in the National Post and Post Media from coast to coast to coast. Thanks, gentlemen.
Pleasure.
Thank you.
The Agenda with Steve Bacon is brought to you by the Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario, helping businesses stay on the right side of change with strategic thinking, insightful decisions, and business leadership. Are you on the right side of change? Ask an Ontario CPA.